those out on tables? Do you want me to put those out on the table? The microphone? Oh, yes. Okay. Hi, I'm good. How are you? I don't think so. I think we're good to go.
Yeah. You want me to whip anything up real quick here? You want me to whip up that? Oh, hi. Oh, really? Right. She's a nurse, so
I didn't, my daughter is in 8th grade and got to play for the freshman
Oh, wow.
team. And she had been
Aw.
so I felt bad for that, but I absolutely was not
Yeah.
something that anyone wanted me to be around. So
That's right.
yeah, and so I was in bed like the entire weekend. Which
Aw.
wasn't, but
That's probably like that.
I think so. I'm not really great at heeding my own advice.
I bet you're not so good at laying around.
Yeah, no, I'm not. Hi. I'm gonna. That's fine. Just don't.
That's okay.
Hi,
how are you, Jim?
Nice to see you. How have you been? Lighted. Always good. Always good. It's,
Good. Hi, Corey. How are you? Good. Good to see you. Yeah, I can switch you. I'm happy to swap spots with you. Sure. Oh, easy. I met with someone else this morning who was here.
Oh, really?
I did. My favorite one.
Yep.
With the 30 minutes later when so you have to run. You have to run. So I would have over instead well, I did too. It ended up being really boundaries. But I was out like that. It's my favorite flight. And it's the regulars.
It seems like I see the same people. I see the same people a lot.
That'll be us someday. It's our dinner tonight. Did Deanne tell you?
Yeah, no, that's. We didn't. It's kind of one of those things. Want to be in this world?
Well, that way I can see the room.
Yeah, no problem.
Although I think that's where she was last time.
See pictures of all of them.
This one here. Sit back there. I sit back there.
Yeah.
Might as well.
Okay. I'm eating. Right.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
they allow us to do stuff.
People go too far.
Hi, is this Angela? Hello? Can you hear? I'll be back in 5 minutes. Okay.
You can get the last week.
Regardless,
His last week.
Cheese in the morning.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, you're there. You're still here. Putting the seat.
You looked this way, but you couldn't see it. Why didn't
It's the game. Did you move it? I moved it. I was not going to do that. What's the
I mean, it gives you a bit. Middle school, it's Memorial Day. So, that's what happens.
crazy day about my nephew who's in school for
No
emergency
long-term.
surgery. They're the doctor.
You know that's the problem. You know, if they had only gone to school, they would have gone on to everything else. They wouldn't be.
Hi there.
They'd be
Hey, there.
Right,
Next
they're
week,
always
yeah.
that
Yeah.
And it's the rising
Yeah.
high wars,
Yeah. Well,
which causes a girl.
then he would have been a lawyer. Would have been better. Long time no see.
Yeah, I was gonna say you can't get rid of me.
Yeah, I know. The other way around. Yeah.
Medication.
Good. How are you?
So it went well. That's so scary. Yes. And frankly, just I watch the surgeries.
Screaming, yelling.
Traumatic.
Right. There you go. There you go.
And the divorce between 2 weeks. And so they didn't know why we they didn't go to school. Yes,
Now they know.
fine.
One of our sons had
2 minutes.
spinal tap done. 8 weeks old.
Oh, hey, yeah, let me know.
Meningitis. That was awful. Just that. So I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it is.
It's good though. I'm gonna go see him right after.
That's so awesome.
His older brother who's
Fun. Sleepover.
Yep. Sam.
Are you gonna go to the administrative meetings? Yeah, I'm gonna try to go all 5. I think it'll be fascinating. I'll sit back and like I said.
Good. How are you?
Sure, little guy.
What is?
How long do you?
Oh yeah, I did too. They, oh yeah. Look at. Brianna's good. All right, she's gonna. I just had to make sure.
We live on the. Yeah. It's always tough, but my son graduated from Roosevelt at 9, my daughter's 13, and they both went to medicine. We're just like a lot. There was like 5 or 6 kids. I went to Roosevelt. I think also just a face of it. High school is beyond the boundaries.
And now there's
So you'll be trying to say a couple of nice words, and then it goes to the drug right away.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah. In fact, I've read that even classroom unions aren't as popular because people still have found they can stay in touch with you. Once every 10 years. That's right. Tony, how's it going, sir? You're all set, man.
Well, the place you go. More. Yeah.
Christine Cooper has a Hello Fresh mouth for me when I get home. So she said, "Don't eat anything." Well, it's enticing. Yeah. Have you?
Why there's many emails flying back to us?
Yeah.
Back.
Back when Tina's wife was.
Yeah, maybe that means more.
right. That's what I was
Especially for a couple like you that's kind of saying, "Oh, yeah, it is."
How many days?
I know.
Full sort of just interacted. So that helped out a lot. But I would say, and we have first goals,
Right.
that helps out as well. But I mean, most nights it's
That's teacher food.
anything better than
No, I get it.
Yeah.
We don't know. Yeah. Because there's not.
if you're younger, that was so much. So it's great that you're teacher. But one thing really makes sense. I mean, they want to so yeah, we had these 6 4 and
That's been
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no, they live in Rapid. They came down to help out, so that really helped out. But still, I mean, 3 years is long. She
We'll see. In Georgia, I am always
better than the redundancy. I mean, she's such a big
There's pictures. Sure. She's got. I think my well, and once you've done
I mean, is there a reason?
I've had Rachel take pictures of the grades, so she does.
So,
Yeah, they have plenty of fireworks on Tuesday nights.
almost like, yeah, must-see TV. Almost.
Yeah, exactly.
before I was not important. My wife just last night she was going to a new place. For a one bedroom, one bedroom studio. It's, so it was like, and I used to go to a really nice place. And I'm going to so this is growth for a one bedroom studio. Almost having a flashback.
Yeah. I feel like that one would be the ones that are.
We looked up on my friends for years ago. They were trying to
Oh, it's a skill.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again for our third meeting. We have a lot to cover tonight, so we're going to jump right in. And before I turn things over to our co-chairs, I wanted to go through just very quickly our agenda tonight. Again, we've got a lot to cover. Again, we're going to review our middle school options. Doug will spend some time doing that with us, along with some high school options. Then Dr. James Nold will speak with us tonight about open enrollment. It's something that came up in our previous meetings. We're going to do some small group work. We're going to have you report out. And then we'll go back to Doug Morrison, who will talk about next steps in the process before we close things down for the night. Part of this will be you have a feedback sheet in front of you. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but there'll be an opportunity for you to provide some information that will go, in addition to the work that we're doing here, some additional work, additional ideas that will go to school board members. So again, a lot of things to do tonight. Just want to tell you how grateful I am that you're here this evening. We're going to move pretty quickly. Again, a lot of work to do. So with that, I'll turn things over to our co-chairs.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for arriving and being here on time. As we get things started, I first of all want to echo Joe's comments. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the great communication that we've had in between not only our first and second meeting, but then our second and today, which is our final meeting. I think that communication has been wonderful, and it's always good when you all have gone out and have had the conversations that need to be had with our community members, with parents of students who are impacted by the changes that will take place. With the boundaries, I would be remiss if I did not thank Joe for facilitating this process for us. And then please remember to turn those mics on when you are ready to speak, as well as the Let's Talk app is available once again. I promised I'd keep my comments short, so I will turn it over to Doug.
Thank you, Janan. Good evening, everybody. Going to start tonight. We're going to just kind of recap kind of quickly the two middle school options. If you recall, we sort of had four that we were working with. We narrowed it down, at least for this purpose, to create some high school options to two, which we're now referring to as A and B. So just going to refresh everybody to what now is option A, which you should have gotten your materials that were sent out ahead of time. I would say the signature part of option A is that it's just JFK area here going to Edison. That's how I look at the signature part of this, this option. It's also the option that we have heard from parents, but the whole idea, again, starting with the concept of the memorial area, which at this point is very crowded, and how you conceptually break that down into a smaller middle school. And so again, I go back to, you have this area up here, which is a walk area. If you recall, we had an option here where we took the Pettigrew area and we were busing it up to McGovern, and the group was one of the lower ranking of the four. And then we really were left with two at that point. One is, again, JFK to Edison. And then the other thing about this option too is it has currently both specialty programs are at Edison. That's the honors program and the Spanish immersion program that continue on into middle school. This essentially breaks them up and leaves the Spanish immersion program at Edison and moves the honor program to Patrick Henry. And I know we've heard comments, and it's great. Well, move some of the specialty programs to McGovern or another school, and we appreciate that feedback. And it's something that, you know, at the end of the night, if you want to communicate to the board that you still feel that way, that's great to write that down. We look at it simply as between those two programs, there's about 600 kids that attend those specialty programs, and over half of them come from those two school areas. So it's a little more logistically friendly to keep those programs in the core of the city rather than moving them to the outskirts. So that's another piece of this of option A. Option B, again, this was an option that again was looking at trying to take the memorial situation and to create a smaller middle school. Instead, this moves JFK back into Memorial, and it takes this Alfred bus area, and it moves it up to McGovern. There's another way to alleviate the crowding in this side. And then you can also see that what I call these the three kind of offshoot areas. In this option, it has them going to McGovern, so it's using a TLS road as a boundary. And when we get to high school, you'll be able to see the additional area that's coming in there. In option A, those were staying in the Memorial District. So that's another, has to do with this option. Now, in this option, we were able to leave both the Spanish immersion program and the honors program at Edison. Because once we moved JFK back here and we moved these students up to McGovern, we were able to take some of these students that were open here, move them into Patrick, and freed up some room here at Edison so we could keep both programs there. That's really the highlight of option B. So those are the two middle school options, if you think about it, that we're kind of working with now as an option A and an option B. The next page there that you have in your workbook were simply some of the statistics, if you will, of what some of those numbers start to look like, because you have, you sort of start with the kids that are actually residing in that area, and then you have to overlay them with the kids from the specialty programs And since we know kind of where they live, because they're in a specialty program either at Sonia Sotomayor or over here at Robert Frost now, we kind of know where those kids live, and so we're able to predict where they live and then how many would have to come into those groups. And so under either option, you kind of end up with a final count of students at each high school in that case. So, and then you have what the current enrollments are here. So you can see, for instance, Memorial at 1369, and then under both options, that school becomes slightly smaller. And Ben Rifle, keeping a little bit smaller. If you remember last week, we had a presentation from Sam and the city on where the growth areas were going to happen, and it was basically the Ben Rifle area, the southeast part of town, and then up in the George McGovern area or the west side. So that's kind of where, at this point, where things are looking from a middle school perspective as far as option A and B. So we'll move forward to, and then in your materials you just have some different graphics and stuff that we've given you before. So we'll move on to high school option A. And in high school option A, just like in middle school, where our goal was to feed as many like elementary schools to middle schools, one of the goals at the high school, amongst other things, was try to get to have middle schools feed to high schools. Now that doesn't exactly work out exactly, because you'll have 4 high schools and 6 middle schools, so it's impossible to do that. But in this scenario, we can do it with 4 of them. So this is sort of modeled off of, you can see Ben Rifle in its entirety would go to Washington. You can see that Patrick Henry in its entirety would go to Lincoln. Edison would be Roosevelt. McGovern would all be the new Thomas Jefferson. And then you have 2 splitter middle schools, which would be Whittier. So this part of Whittier would go to Washington, and this part would go to Lincoln. And then in this scenario, you have this area going up to Thomas Jefferson and of Memorial, and this bottom part staying into Roosevelt. Option B is much the same. Where we differ in option B is, if you remember, in option B, we ended up with more kids in Patrick Henry because we moved these kids up here, and we moved some of these kids to keep McGovern at a good number into here. And so that made Lincoln a little bit larger, and I'll come back to some of the dialogue around Lincoln and sort of what goes on there from an open enrollment perspective. But in this option, we then came and we took some of the kids in this area and we moved them into Washington. So whereas before in option A, it would look more like this, and there's a graphic we can, I think if we can show the, yeah, so you can see in this option A, you can see Washington is pretty much here. In this option, we're going in and taking more of this area and putting it into Washington. So going back a slide, kind of cover some of the dynamics of what goes on at high school and what's happening today. So we sort of start with a capacity number, which is an FTE capacity number. And the way that Jeff does that is he knows all of the rooms that are in high school, and we have certain rooms that are designated for certain things that aren't normal classrooms. They could be for the RISE program, or they could be art classrooms or things of that nature. You end up with a number of classrooms that are available, and we have our ratios of what we have adopted as standards for our high schools. So let's just say, as an adjective, it's 25 students to 1 classroom. And so based on open rooms, we're able to figure out a capacity of kids that would be in those rooms at any one point in time. And then we kind of look at a 85 and 90% capacity for those schools. Now, the first thing we have to do with the high schools is we have to look at our base number. So if I just look at the number of kids that are enrolled or that their home attendance centers for that high school, that's basically what that looks like under option A and option B. And then you have the current enrollments up here as a reference point. So in other words, for option A, I have 1,452 kids that are in the home attendance center of Jefferson. And New Tech is going to be located at Jefferson. That is running right now at about 300. We'd like to grow that, get that back to the 400 range. One of the things that we think may have been holding that back is that it hasn't been at a traditional high school, so there haven't been activities and things like that. It's a great school. It's going to be part of the Thomas Jefferson campus, and so we're hoping over time that we can grow that number. But when you look at Jefferson, you really have to look at those two together. And so all we can do is project the number based on what we see today is what might go there. And then you can see the other schools and how they play out. Now you get into open enrollment. Dr. Knoll's going to come up here and give you a presentation on open enrollment and how we manage it today. But we know that today we have a heavy presence of open enrolling kids into Lincoln High School. And so what I've done in these scenarios is I have looked at the freshman cohort, the latest cohort that's gone to Lincoln from an open enrollment perspective, and I've looked at where their home attendance center is, and so I can kind of project out if this enrollment sort of continued at that pace, I would have about 400 kids in that high school that would want to open enroll to Lincoln. Now, we have no idea what those patterns are going to go once the new high schools are going on, but I do know I have kids that are sort of attending there now that we have to account for. But we have to make some assumptions at this point to be able to right-size these schools. I also know that I have out-of-district kids that enroll today in the school district. And I have about 300 of them through the 4 grades. Again, the majority going into Lincoln. And if you look at the south part of town, that's where they come from, up into Lincoln. And so what we have to do then is sort of an overlay, taking the home attendance centers, making some assumptions for open enrollment, assuming that we want to allow the same freedom for students and parents to open enroll into schools, or that it continues with the same pattern, and to arrive at what might be a post-enrollment number or head count. And so really what that's doing is taking the home attendance center, making an allowance for in-district and out-of-district enrollment to come up with a final, not final, but a projected head count at each one of those high schools. Now, that's head count. So I want to go back, and when you get into Dr. Knoll's presentation, you'll see some 2,100 numbers. You'll say, how does that relate to the 1,800 number? Because I know it's come up. When we're looking here at head count, we know that these are the kids that are assigned to that home attendance school, but we know on any given day that all of those kids aren't in those schools. There's a large majority that attend the CTE school out by STI out in that area. So we have buses that run from each school out to there, and so there's hundreds of kids that go out there on a daily basis. So their home attendance center is maybe Lincoln or Roosevelt, but they're attending part of their day out there. And so we also have kids that we know that their home attendance center are the traditional schools, but they might attend an alternative high school like a Joe Foss. We also know that in these head count numbers are some RISE kids, which are some of our kids with disabilities that are in different areas of the school that are accounted for a little bit differently. So we try to apply a factor, and in this case, when we got together, we said, it's probably around 10 to 15% of the kids that are assigned those home attendance centers that aren't in those buildings every day, that might be attending somewhere else in the district, or they're in a specialty room that's not accounted for. So that's kind of how we build on that. And so, so that's kind of the background information with sort of how we built that. And then, of course, I think below that, you've got some demographic information that we've given you, which you can look at by school. And so, which is for your use. So I think that's probably a good time to have Dr. Nold come up and give you a presentation on open enrollment, and also to get some of your feedback around open enrollment, how we're going to manage that going forward, your thoughts around who gets grandfathered in, who doesn't, what's required by state law, et cetera. So, Dr. Nold?
Yes, I must use my hands too much, so she was worried I would not talk into the mic. I'll go through some of the information with you on the open enrollment aspect, and I know that's been a point of conversation for several people, and yet it may not really need to be, because some of that's going to be governed by law, and it's going to take a little bit of time and attrition to go through that process of the open enrollment as far as it pertains to the numbers in each one of those schools, the middle schools and the high schools. So I'll talk about open enrollment a little bit in the process I utilize when we're approving and working through the open enrollment process. I'll go fairly quickly. I will allow some time there at the end if you have some questions, but I think you'll see that it may not be the concern as much of the open enrollment as it is who's going to be grandfathered in and what we're going to use as that criteria. And that's probably where your feedback will come in more so. But I'll at least give you that topic so that that concern isn't lying out there for you. So first of all, with the open enrollment, really look at three things. And if you wish to, if you have time tonight and desire, you can go in and look at policy JCA and the regulation that corresponds with that, JCA-R. But there's three things we look at. One is the building capacity, the number of students that should be allowed within that building. You'll see the numbers are elevated right now because we need to account for kids that are in there. But when I talk to a parent and say, you know what, that building's at capacity, that means the building in and of itself, we've hit that number. Any student that lives within that boundary will automatically still get a go there, but I can't approve other residency exceptions or open enrollments into that building. The second criteria then I look at is the class capacity. So we have numbers set for individual classes as well. Middle school, it's a class count. In the high schools, we really start to look at the class size averages. So the averages that would be in those individual classrooms. And then a third part of it is a program capacity. I won't spend as much time on that, but I'll hit on it just briefly. So we'll go into the next one here. And first of all, what we have right now set as the building capacities at the three high schools is 2,100, 2,200, 2,200. So it means once they go beyond that, just based on building capacity, we're going to say we can't approve an open enrollment or residency exception. Those numbers eventually are going to come down. I assume significantly down, so we balance out the schools and have a more equal proportional numbers at each one of those schools. So right now they're set higher. That's through the policy, and through the policy process, we'll look to lower those numbers once we have that fourth high school of Jefferson online. So right now with those numbers, we look at that as the overall. Middle schools are all set at 1,100 mark. So obviously you start to think about a school like Memorial that's closed. And I'll show you some of the open enrollment numbers as we come up here. And some would wonder, well, Memorial has our least number of open enrolled students. It's not because students aren't desiring to go there. It's just we've had to have it closed for so long that the numbers have just diminished off to where it's virtually now just siblings. And there's a law that impacts that we do have to allow siblings in. On the next capacity piece is the classroom. So with the classroom, we set that in the high schools, 600, 550, 550, 550. We realize as the students move up into the 10th, 11th, 12th grades, that more and more students will begin to go to the CTE Academy and go out to other locations. So even though those class numbers seem that they will diminish over time, part of that is still to keep the class count and the FTE count that had been alluded to earlier. We look at those reduced numbers up there because that student body or the head count may be a little bit different than our number count that we use for FTE, because some of those will be out of the building at a time. at different times. So, but anyway, just going through that, the high school, 600, 550, 550, 550. In the middle school, it's a 350 for each one of the grades, so 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So we'll look at that as the second criteria. If that class grade, 6th grade, is above 350, then any additional open enrollments or residency exceptions would be denied to that, regardless of what the overall building count is. So it may be that they have a very large 6th grade class, so I can't approve any more in the 6th grade, but I could in 7th or 8th grade, depending on the school. A school like Memorial, it's automatically closed for everything because its overall count, which would be the building count, is above that 1,100 mark. So we really break it down then into the individual class sizes and decide whether we can accept additional open enrollments based on that. The third and final one is program capacity. There's a lot of specialized programs that we have to also be cautious of. And those we'll look into and see, is there space available for the resources that we have to be provided for those specialized programs to see whether we can approve an open enrollment or not. Generally speaking, it's going to be based on those first two criteria, the overall building being available or the class size. The third one then and the final one is this program capacity. The next piece of this, and I'll just give you a little bit of an idea of overall numbers. So when we look at this right now, in district open enrollment moves, for the high school, there's about 200 ninth graders that open enroll to different high schools. So they may be, their home attendance center is Roosevelt and they're open enrolled to Lincoln, or it'd be at Lincoln and they're open enrolled to Washington. There's about 200 ninth graders that move that way within our district. 10th grade, about 213, 11th grade, 208. I just stayed with those three classes right now because with the seniors moving out, but you can prorate that. Out of district to come in, right now we have those numbers in 9th grade, about 66, 99, 86. So it fluctuates, it all depends. Those numbers, obviously we have had additional space. If we had additional space at schools like a Memorial or an Edison, you know, Patrick Henry eventually closes. And you can kind of see here, go ahead and you can go to the next one. I'll just pull out Lincoln's for right now. It's been fairly steady on each of those from within the district. If you look at the numbers, the ninth graders that have open enrolled into Lincoln, 155, 161, 157. Out of district, 35, 39, 39. So it stays fairly consistent that way, and they would have a greater capacity right now. I don't even bother to show, for example, Roosevelt, because it's going to be almost zero across the board. At one time, if you go back 7, 8, 9 years, 10 years, that would have been a higher number. But because it's been closed for so long through the attrition process, that number's gone virtually down to zero, other than a few siblings. That will, as we open some of that up, allow for possibly more open enrollments at a Jefferson, and eventually, see that 51, 89, 161, out of district 49, 66, 49. So some will start to wonder, why has that dropped so much at that 6th grade? It's because the middle schools are becoming closed off to the open enrollment process. So it isn't that there's a less desire to open enroll, it's just that there isn't that option to be able to open enroll, as those numbers have met a building capacity. Because once it hits that capacity, I just can't keep approving those. We begin to get too large of a school. So that's been dropping. If you go to specifically, Patrick Henry would be our largest in open enrolled middle school right now. And if you even look at that, just on the numbers of in-district open enrollments, you can see where that 6th grade class has gone down to 17, or 8th grade it was 93. If I would pull back the 9th graders in there that are now 9th grade that were 8th grade, that number is even going to be higher than the 93. Through attrition, it's gone down to where they just cannot accept open enrollments anymore. So that number continues to decline as we go through each one of the years, the longer that building has been closed. A majority of those 17 6th graders are probably siblings. And so as you go through and look at that with the state law, you need to look and give preference to a sibling if there's another sibling that's already in that school currently. Now, if they're 8th grader moving into 9th grader and coming in as new 6th grader, you don't have to give preference there. But those really aren't the numbers that you would necessarily be worried about, because the law will govern part of that. You can go to the next one. The open enrollment law on that, we do need to look at individual students and honor the open enrollment. So if they're already approved open enrollment to a Lincoln, Washington, Roosevelt, we would honor that going through. That's part of the law. So it may take 3 or 4 years for a number at Lincoln to drop down, because some of those open enrollments will need to go through the point of attrition, and some of that will come off. It took that same thing with, as you could see in the numbers previous, with Patrick Henry. So they had a large number of open enrollments. That went down to 17 sixth graders this last year because it closed to open enrollment. Well, it'll take a while for those 17 to go through, and if they have a sibling, they could be allowed that same open enrollment aspect because of the state law. So it's probably a little less that you have to worry about. How does open enrollment, do you have to make a decision on the open enrollment? No, not really. It's really going to come down to a decision of what's the space available and what's the law say that we have to do, and then what's the preference of the sibling behind that. Now, there is some other parts that you would need to make some decisions on. So right now, one of the questions that we'd need this group to discuss is at the high school. What groups would be, when the boundary lines are drawn new, what groups would be allowed to stay or not stay? They would need to go to the new boundary center. So if you go in there, 9th graders, are they allowed to stay or not? Well, some would say that's probably an obvious choice. You're not going to have much of a building there, but you don't start requiring some groups to go to their attendance center. But then as you go all the way through that list, what about the seniors? So the seniors that have been there for the 3 years, they're currently 11th graders. When this does come online with Jefferson, what about those seniors? Should they have the option of staying, or should they not be allowed to stay? If we look at that same thing with the question of the middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th, and you may have opinions on that one way or another, that would be up to you in your group discussions to be able to talk through that. Does it make as much difference for a middle school student? Is there that same involvement in the activities and that commitment to that individual school, whether it be fine and performing arts or athletics or other clubs and events that they're involved in? Is there that same comparison with the high school that there is middle school, or middle school that there is the high school? So that's the second part of it. In the middle school, what would be allowed to stay? And then the third piece is, what about their sibling? So if you do, by chance, as a group, say, yes, we do believe a senior should be allowed to stay at the school that they're currently at, and not be required to go to the new attendance center, or have that option that they could. Well, then what about if they have a sibling that's coming in as a brand new 9th grader? Should they be allowed or afforded that same option or not? So those are some discussion points. It's a lot less to do with open enrollment. Open enrollment will take care of itself through the law and through over a few years of attrition. So even if that number seems high at a building right now, if open enrollment is part of that impact, it'll come down. It'll balance out to those numbers that we have, because if it's still above whatever number we set that at, if it's currently at 2,100 or 2,200, if we reset that at 1,900, it'll start to come down to that, because open enrollment will peel off. So really the questions you have that are going to come up is, what do you do with 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th? Are they required to go to the new attendance center, or can they stay, and what grades could stay? And then siblings. Are siblings allowed to do that same thing? Questions before you have that discussion. Is there anything that I went through there that you wished I had stopped and given you a chance to ask a question?
So we've talked a little bit about Harrisburg, and you said that the open enrollment out of district was required by state law, but why is Sioux Falls not able to open enroll into Harrisburg, if that's a state law?
A school district can close their district to open enrollment.
Okay.
So they have closed their district to open enrollment. You'd have to ask them the reasons why. I'm sure it's due to their growth and things. That'd be up to them to answer. But a district can close their open enrollment. So we could say as a district we are closed to open enrollment.
So that's not necessarily driven by state law. It's
that
a
is not
district
driven
decision.
by the state law. It's an option that they could have to close their boundaries from open enrollment. Okay. Other questions? Okay. So the discussion questions in your group. Take some time now, and we'll give you 5-10 minutes. Maybe it won't take that long. But to discuss through, if anyone, who should be allowed to be the groups that would stay at their current sites if, where the boundaries go, they'd be required to go to a new school, or their home attendance center would fall into a new school. should 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. Then the same question to the middle school students, 6th, 7th, and 8th. Is there any there that you feel should be allowed or afforded the right to stay at the school they are or have that option? Once you answer that, go into the next question of, what about a younger sibling? Because just like open enrollment, it could take a few years then that siblings go through that process, because if one's a senior and is allowed to stay and they have an incoming 9th grader and they start to move through, what happens about that 5th grader that eventually is going to come up and through as well. So those questions there, you can just discuss in your groups, and then we'll report out here after. I'll give you at least a 2-3 minute warning. Yes, a question.
So if, say you have a junior in a high school right now that opens and rolls, and they have a 5th grade sibling, that junior's gone by the time that sibling gets there. Is that 5th grader right now currently able to open enroll?
They would have to apply for the open enrollment.
Okay.
Yep. So they can apply for the open enrollment just the same way but they don't have the sibling preference then, because the sibling would not be in that building, so that takes away that sibling preference. So they'd still have the option to open enroll, and we still have hundreds of those that happen every year. December 1st, there's a long line. We're working on an electronic version that'll be done online, so people aren't in line, are in line instead of standing in line. But yeah, they would lose the sibling preference, but they'd still have the option to be able to request the open enrollment. Other questions? Okay, we'll give you some time to be able to discuss that. Who was allowed to?
I still have it. Anytime. Sometimes 5:15 a.m., sometimes noon, sometimes.
Thought about it.
I- This weekend's supposed to be in the 40s. Tonight, though, it's supposed to be really cool. No, Nicole does though.
Does she?
Yeah. Yeah, good workout. Yeah. Just gonna do school workout.
I don't know, do you want me to take a total report out on that, or?
Yeah, I think so, because you.
Yeah. Yeah, there will be.
Oh, nice. You can golf and ski in the same golf Friday and ski Saturday. Are you gonna ski out there? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Kids, we have little tiny hills.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you're gonna take them out and let them, yeah.
I'm sure his wife loves it.
Sure, yeah.
They have a I don't think she has a problem. It's easy. It's the same trip every year, 10 years in a row.
Yeah.
We get the same restaurants.
And more Everest conference? Mount McKinley or something? Or-
I've never done any rock climbing before. I saw some guys out there that were
Sorry. It's okay.
So like propelling and stuff?
It's actually.
If I get to the rafters. So I've gotten better. There were some parts where keep it on because we not taking videos. I watched it with Leah. That's it. This has been it. Well. He's been right for years, so that's what he's doing. Yeah, right. This guy. Steve was supposed to. So. That's great. That's maybe he'll do that. Steve said that you could sit in the throne, like the throne chair.
Okay, just give you a minute here to wrap up your conversations, then we'll pull the group back in and have some report outs on this. Okay, I'll pull you back together now. And if we just have somebody from each of the table, and there's differing view of a couple people wanted to report from the table, but at least one person from each of the table that you would designate as someone that could report out some of the discussion that you had or some of the decisions you had. And if you can, please hit on each of those. What should happen in the high school, or what's the feelings of your table at the high school, at the middle school, and then what about siblings? So, a table that'd like to start. Got our first volunteer.
At our table, we discussed keeping the social groups of the kids together as much as we could. And we figured out in our discussions that high school, definitely the 12th graders, and we had a preference, if we could, to keep the 11th and 12th graders together. And then we started talking about middle schoolers, and we thought that possibly the 8th graders could stay in the middle schools. But we also were talking that at some point, there's going to be a transition, and the more middle schoolers you kind of keep together where they are right now versus putting them into new boundaries, the longer that kind of attrition rate is going to take. So I think we settled on 11 and 12 and 8. And then as far as siblings are concerned, we looked at the numbers and we thought that the way you guys are handling the way siblings are treated, either in district or out of district, to follow their upperclassmen, the numbers are so small it really wouldn't make that much of a difference. Just keep doing it the way you're doing it. We also thought that depending on how the numbers fall, the school district might have to accept the fact that you're going to be close to 100% capacity for a short period of time. Did I sum it up? Okay. Okay.
Very good. One of the other tables.
So we looked at incoming seniors with siblings could stay, not the incoming juniors. They've been at the school for 2 years, so they're a little bit more flexible dealing with the change. And then as with the middle school, incoming 8th graders and siblings would be able to stay. A lot along the same reasons the first table did. You know, there's going to be some flexibility. There's going to be change. So those incoming 6th and 7th graders would go to the new school. One area that we talked about, and we still have a question on, is specialty programs. Deanna brought up finance. There's one high school that has finance, and we thought, should people that are in those specialty programs be allowed to finish out those specialty programs if they span the entire high school, the 4-year time span?
Good, because there are some specialty Latin that's taught at one school. Now, regardless of what school they attend, they could take that at that one school. Same way with JROTC, it's only taught at 2 of the 3 currently. And if a student wishes to from Roosevelt, they could go to one of those other 2 to take JROTC. American Sign Language is only taught at Washington. Students from the other two schools do come to that school to take the class. So some of that can still be accounted for. Same way when you talk about some specialized other courses, we do a lot of times allow students to come from those other schools to attend those. But that's a great point. Others?
Well, I think that at our table, we sort of felt like at some point there's going to be a change, and it's going to be hard no matter where we draw that line. And we looked at the desire to kind of fill those new schools sooner rather than later. And so we felt like seniors should probably have the option to stay, just because that's a tough time to make a change. But incoming 11th graders would have spent a couple years at one school, and they would still have 2 years at another school. Sort of a, neither here nor there situation. As far as middle school, we felt like it might be best to make the change right away, just because that's who they're going to feed them to high school with. So we thought maybe the middle schoolers should just go, and siblings, we sort of felt like maybe would need to make the change, which is tough for families if they're splitting, but sort of a rip the Band-Aid off.
Thank you.
So we started from a place where we began by entertaining the idea of 8th through 12th could stay. But then as we talked about it, much as other groups have said, we thought about the fact that the new schools, Jefferson and Rifle, would be largely empty for the first 3 years in high school and 1 year for the middle school. So then we started to think about, okay, what if we split it upperclassmen and lowerclassmen, so juniors and seniors could stay, and then freshmen and sophomores would start in the new track right away, and then also in the middle school giving the option for 8th graders to stay, but then the 6th and 7th graders would start right away. We did think it was an important point that it was an option, but not a requirement to stay. I think that's been echoed as well. So, did I miss anything? Oh, and we said siblings got to start right away on all levels. Okay. So no preference given to siblings. Okay.
Our conversation was that we kind of agreed that we think 11th and 12th graders should be given the option to stay. And also down in middle school, 8th graders would be given the option. And then we also felt that siblings should be allowed to stay with their other, if they want to also. Some of the discussion we had was about activities, as far as if they're at a school that doesn't have marching band, or that's not a good example, but if the activity that they're in now isn't going to be available at the new school, whether it's middle school or high school, would they be allowed to stay? Also, there's going to be students that want to go to the new high school, so that's a factor that's hard to tell. So if you say that it's an option, you got to answer that, I guess, after it's all said and done, as to how many students actually are going to go to the new high school. So.
And that's a good question. I'd anticipate, and that'll come through the policy process, because right now it's in-board policy, that there'll be a pretty consistent number across all those schools as far as building capacity. And then obviously, if the Jefferson's not full, it does open up opportunities for individuals to open enroll that they choose to. That'll also limit it, though, on class capacity. So that class capacity is set at 500. It would not be all freshmen that are just open enrollment. But yeah, that's a good discussion point. Okay. Thank you very much, and we'll take that information as a sum. Seniors seem to be predominantly a preference to stay. There's a mixture of juniors in and up there, and then 8th graders was the other group that was predominantly discussed as an option to stay. I get it that there's some of those that were mixed, and then it's a little bit of a mixed bag with the siblings. Some leaning towards the fact to treat it the same as the open enrollment process, where we allow siblings to have that opportunity. And as I said, all those things, with the open enrollment, That's going to work itself out over a few years time period. The same would happen to siblings if that is an option that the board does. That would work itself over a time period. People just have to realize that number wouldn't drop down to an 18 or 1900 automatically. It takes a few years to get there. So thank you.
Dr. Knoll, thank you. Folks, I said at the beginning that we were going to keep things moving, and so we're going to go to the next part of the agenda, which is to double back and to consider the high school options that Doug Morrison reviewed a little earlier. So here's what we're going to do next. We'd ask you to spend some more time in your small groups talking about what was discussed with the high school options. We'll give you some time to do that, and we'll do just as you've done before. We'll come back, and then we'll have your report out, okay? So consider high school.
Yeah.
Oh, I think that's all. And I'm not sure what but I know that I'm right. This is, yeah. I'm not sure what that is. That is. Yeah, because I go like one,
Right?
No. That's why. That's why. My brother, he would say I have two older brothers.
And then I think that's what else. They might not be. Absolutely right. That's what we said earlier.
Morning? Morning, you think? Okay, folks, about 2 more minutes. 2 more minutes. Okay. Lots to discuss. I appreciate the conversations as I was making my way around the room, the great conversations that were being had at the tables. Who'd like to begin with our reporting out? Go ahead, please. And again, remember to use the microphones, please.
So I guess we'll start with a question. So in the last session, we had whittled down the options from 5 to 2, and then one of the task force members asked to see a third option that tried to move the needle on Whittier for socioeconomic balancing. So we were just curious if there is a third option coming, or if what we have tonight is what we have.
No, we looked at Whittier, and it'd be a little bit of the same scenario. Here we go here. trying to, you would be in a scenario where you would be, it would be somewhat like the option that we came up with on the west side where you ended up doing it north and south. So you would end up moving some of these folks, like a Harvey Dunn or whatnot, up to Whittier, and then you would be moving these kids down. It would be more of a north-south scenario. And we just didn't think of that as being a realistic option in a sense. Whittier's, kind of a neighborhood school now, and they kind of have a sense of community, and so when we looked at those scenarios, we just felt like this was a better scenario, being able to move Cleveland, Rosa Parks, Harvey Dunn, and part of John Harris gave us a pretty good mix there, and so it was more of that discussion, but we certainly looked at it.
Others? Go ahead. Sam?
Hello. So as far as the options for high schools, our two with the overlays would be option B and middle school overlay of B as well. Those would decrease the number of kids that would have to change one school to another. It would keep the cohorts the most similar. And as far as like socioeconomic and other things, it doesn't really change all that much no matter which option we choose. So if you're prioritizing anything, that would be it.
Who else?
So at this table, we continue to have quite a bit of discussion about the concern that there just really has been no improvement to Whittier, in fact, possibly even a little step backwards. And so with the program discussion, which you shared that there was some review at Spanish immersion and honor splitting, and one going to Patrick, one going to Edison, has Whittier been considered for either of those programs, because it would be a socioeconomic lift for Whittier? And I think that's just where we kind of keep coming back to, there just really hasn't been, there's been a lot of improvement at McGovern, but we're just not seeing changes at Whittier.
Yeah. Well, I think
just wondering
Whittier probably is going to stay about where it is now based on these boundaries. It looks a little bit higher because the free and reduced price numbers that we're using, there are some what we call CEP schools that are 100% free and reduced lunch, so those students get tagged with that. However, when they actually move into middle school, they actually go through a process where they enroll or don't enroll, and it becomes like a 75-25. So what I'm saying is, in Whittier, probably when you look at current versus what it might say now, I think it shows it going up 7%, 6%. That is probably a little overstated. And if you look at the feeder schools into Whittier, it pretty much stays pretty consistent with where it is now. So you're right. I mean, now, if you were going to move a specialty school and you needed to move 300 or 600 kids into Whittier, how would you move 600 kids out of Whittier? That's the trick with any scenario. And so, and so those are all the factors that we have to consider. But we certainly hear you.
Yes, please.
So I guess option 3 we're kind of looking at, or some things we would kind of want to consider is for the Roosevelt School. I'm not sure how the natural boundary was chosen there on the north side, but if you chose to change that to like 26th Street, because there's a lot of kids that walk in that area, and move the eastern boundary back to Western Avenue, we'd be kind of curious to see what those numbers would do, just see if it would balance out a little bit, and it would make it a little more, it would keep the students that walk right now to Roosevelt. So just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, as you're right, I mean, option A and B are out in the community at some point. I don't, however that happens, it happens. But certainly we've been hearing from this group, which is essentially this discovery area. And so I can give you from a perspective of that discovery area amounts to about 600 middle schoolers or high schoolers. So if you were to move that back into Roosevelt, you take 600 kids out of Jefferson, and essentially you say, well, who's going to go to Jefferson then, right? And just how the numbers play. Now, one area that we've been kind of, well, if you can go to the last page. I think it's page, it's actually the last page in your, this area here. This area is currently would be in the Lincoln boundary, okay? And to right size Lincoln, we have moved that in this scenario into Roosevelt. That box there is about 333 kids, I think, in high school equivalent. So that's one area that we have sort of been looking at. And if you didn't have 500 kids enrolling to Lincoln, theoretically you could move that into Lincoln. So it's one area that when it's all said and done, this may come into play. I don't know if that went back to Lincoln. Could you move some part of that back into Roosevelt? You could, but then you come back to, well, who's going to go to Thomas Jefferson, right? And so that's the balancing act that we face as a district, is trying to make sure that all of our schools are, if not equal, we know certainly that Thomas Jefferson will be smaller to begin with, but we also know that that's where the growth is, either from, just up in here in general, or this area that's being added onto out here. And when you heard Sam and the city folks talk last time, you heard them talk about certainly the most future growth. It may not be 5 years, but eventually it'll be the growth into there. And then, like somebody said, how many may just want to go to a new, brand new $85 million high school? And because of whatever reason, we don't exactly know the open enrollment patterns that will exist at some point. We know what they are today. And so, and we know we have a pipeline of students that we have to allow for. But I would say this area, and certainly we're hearing a lot from the west side in this area, under middle school, and now under high school because of this area. And we get it. And I'll talk about kind of next steps in a little bit here, but we know we're going to take what the great feedback that the 33 of you have given us, and we're going to get it, like a fire hose with 25,000 community citizens out there. And that's okay. That's what we're here for. That's what we want to hear, right? And so I don't have any notion that at the end of the day in June, when the 5 board members make their decision, that it's going to be exactly A or B, or A or B or a high school. I think it's continuing an evolution and dialogue amongst our community and what we hear to arrive at the best solution for the most, knowing that we're not going to meet everybody's needs. And that's really what kind of the journey that we're on, and why we've allowed so much time. And you guys have been so beneficial in giving us that early on feedback as to what we're going to hear out in the community, and bringing those ideas, just like you were talking about the walk area. And then where do you draw the line? Because somebody's always on the line. And so we're hearing feedback, and that's good. It's not surprising, and what we've expected. So I hear you loud and clear on that one, that area. And like I said, this area is another one that I think eventually we'll hear from, because as the crow flies, they're probably closer to Lincoln than to Roosevelt. But this is about 300 kids. This is about 600 kids. So even if you move them into Roosevelt, them out, you're dealing with a net 300 change. Those are the kinds of decisions we're trying to work through. But great feedback.
I think our group spoke just to what you were saying, Doug, which is, why are we allowing so much open enrollment flexibility for Lincoln? If all high schools have the same academic standards, and, why are we allowing so much flexibility there versus maybe securing up some of these neighborhoods? So I think our table was really glad to hear you say that, because we were scratching our heads kind of asking ourselves that same thing, like why traditionally has Lincoln been left so open?
I think in the past we've tried to live by a family choice almost, like if there's room and you can, and we can accommodate it, and somebody wants to go to Lincoln because they're, because of band or some other thing that, we want to make that option available. That's been some of the philosophy in the past, and that even today, I think I might have misspoke, said there was no open enrollment, but I think Washington still has taking open enrollment today. So it's more or less trying to accommodate people in our community about as much as possible to where their kid would like to go. They all have different reasons. When my kids were in high school, my daughter, we were in the Washington district, and she open enrolled to Lincoln because that's where her soccer buddies went. Strange things about why kids choose different schools and maybe things that they participate in. And so, but at some point, that may become more limited than it has in the past. And that's something that the board is going to have to grapple with. And so if you wanted to move these 300 kids in there, then you probably are going to have to be a little more conservative with the amount of the number of kids that open enroll to Lincoln. So this is the journey we're on.
Linda, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I think maybe we should look at that, planning on that many open enrolling into Lincoln, and instead of that, move some of those kids over to Lincoln. And then they'll have change too. I guess it's like they get a priority right now to open enroll into Lincoln. There's always the space for them. Maybe that's not fair to the rest of the community. Yeah. And if we're trying to balance all of this, maybe that needs to.
Certainly a piece of the equation that, now you have to sort of, when you put it all together, you start to see some of those things, and then you have to, it's like a puzzle, right? It kind of, you push in here and it pops out here, right? That's kind of how we feel sometimes, like when we're sitting there, looking at all the different scenarios. It's like, okay, that works. No, but that, and so that's just kind of the mode we're in. But I know we have a great community, and we'll keep dialoguing about it. So, like I said, I don't have any preconceived notion, nor should you think that the district already has its option. We don't. We have worked on creating some straw mans for feedback from you that we'll take to the community, and like I said, hear more and more, which will help to refine where we're at. But eventually, somebody will be on the line, and the board will have to make some tough decisions.
Yes, Doug, I'm hearing what you're saying, but I think we just keep talking backwards on this. But I agree. I think we're putting a lot of focus on these 600 kids that we're saying are open enrollment in Lincoln. When you're saying those are closer, we talked about Whittier a little bit ago, saying it's a neighborhood school. That's been one of our priorities that we have to hit, is to try to keep these neighborhoods. Well, if we're cutting neighborhoods out, so open enrollment can come, and that's what we're focusing on. We're focusing on a very small group. So if we look at it more so, what's close to your thing, said it that way, open enrollment might have to shut down. We're shutting down in Memorial, Roosevelt. And we know right now we've got to fill Jefferson, but we've got to cut numbers at Roosevelt. Well, we keep adding to Roosevelt, so Lincoln can get people over there. So I think we got to focus on that more so than who can open enroll where. Yeah, I guess, John,
perhaps I'm assuming here, but when we look at ethnicity, I definitely prefer option A myself. But when we look at 56% for Lincoln High School, are we factoring in the open enrollment, or is that in addition? I mean, I'm going to assume that with open enrollment students, predominantly are white students, so that would affect.
Yeah, that's home attendance center. So if I bring in, when I overlay that with the open enrollment, because like you're right, it's a lot higher percent. I had that at one time. It's about 7% less. It would drive that. It would drive that number down by about 7% by layering in those open enrollment kids.
So you're talking about 49%.
Yeah.
So that's already factored in.
Yeah. And of course, you know, we're working with. It's interesting phenomenon in the district is when you look at free or reduced price lunch numbers, which is how we kind of measure socioeconomic impact. It might be 50% at elementary school, it drops in middle school, and it drops further in high school, right? Just because maybe less kids aren't enrolling or whatever. So in some cases, when we're using projections, we're taking what they are in elementary school, and I kind of talked about that. We have some schools that are, that 3 schools where their kids automatically get free and reduced price lunch because of the census tract that they're in and things of that nature. And then middle school, it drops, and then, but we're still using those kids as a predictor. So I would say eventually high school will be a little bit less, but there's about a 7% impact when I overlay those open enrollment kids. It'll bring that number down by that much.
And if I just add to that, the one thing that really concerns me, and I really just geography plays a part in this, but that fact that Roosevelt just stays at 7th percentile in terms of ethnicity on both options, and I don't know why we can't be more creative on that. I guess to add to that question, it's my understanding that 61% of the students are bused right now in the school district. Is that correct? That was the stat we talked about last time, I believe.
Sure. Yeah, there's no busing in high school, so.
Okay.
So yes, in middle school, 61%.
Okay. There's no busing in high school, but the CTE does not.
CTE are tripper. They either drive themselves, which is crazy if you've ever been up there when they come in, or there's a bus from each homeschool out to there. So that's how that works. So it's district provide busing, there's 3, essentially CTE, there's 3 block periods during the day where they attend. And then so there's shuttle buses that run back and forth, being able to get kids out there, or they drive themselves, or whatever. So, which there's a fair amount of them that do that.
Others? What else was discussed at your table that hasn't been mentioned yet? You get it all?
I'll kind of, maybe I'll just kind of go to the next, I'll kind of walk through the process as we move forward. We kind of talked about this opening night, but we'll kind of, we're right in here, boundary committee meetings, which you guys have been great. I think we've even taken some feedback tonight around some different options. And then what we will be going into next is the public feedback sessions, which we have 5 of them scheduled officially, 1 at each middle school. I know we'll be adding some, we'll at least be adding some probably Saturday ones, or just where people can't get to a meeting at night. And then essentially at that point, we'll collect all of that and we'll start to dialogue with the board. In a work session in April, we'll present what we've learned along the way to them, and then they really have May and to study those alternatives, ask for more information, however they want the process to evolve at that time. And then the hope is that by the end of June that we formally adopt the new boundaries for the fall of 2021. And then we have a period of time to start doing some community education, family notifications, all of that type of process. But we also, as Dr. Knoll talked about, we have all this transition that we have to figure out. So things like, are there going to be any seniors at Thomas Jefferson? I don't know, right? There might be some kids that want to go there, but that's all going to have to be in a process of enrolling kids, and it's probably going to have to be what I would say outside of the traditional open enrollment process that we have sort of followed, where you come down, get your application in, and you might wait in line, and so it's going to have to be a little more robust, and we're going to have to talk that through. So we may have to go to all of our seniors first and say, where do you want to go next year, right? And then based on that, start to look at what the numbers start to look like, because eventually we have to make staffing decisions off of that. So you have to remember, most of what we're accommodating here is growth that's already in the school system. Now, there's obviously cohorts that are coming out of elementary school that are bigger than current middle school cohorts, and that will drive up middle school enrollment, et cetera. But a good portion of the teachers and staff is going to just be reallocation of teachers and staff that are in the current buildings today. And there's a whole process around that. But we can't begin to determine that now until we know how many kids are going to be theoretically going to each building. So even once the boundaries are sort of adopted, we have a lot of work in the district to do to prepare for the arrival of kids and to determine what kids are going to go where, even though we kind of know in the end state what something might look like as far as a school looks like. And then the next page, first meeting, I didn't want Joe to like ease into it. So I said, let's just make the first one memorial, right? So we're gonna have our, you gotta have a sense of humor. So we're gonna have our first meeting is March 12th at Memorial, right? And I get it. There's a lot of anxiety at the middle school level and what we're seeing at the high school level. And we want to make sure everyone's heard, and we want to make sure that everyone knows that we're taking that feedback and we're going to be refining and looking at, you know, whatever that tells us, right? And then we'll go on to Patrick, Whittier, McGovern, and Edison, and then there'll probably be a few more. But that's, they'll be in the auditoriums that some may be very well attended, some might not. I hope they're all well attended, and that people feel free to give us their feedback. We've had a lot of good feedback through Let's Talk already, which has been great. It really helps us to sort of categorize what we're hearing, and I think that's just been a great tool for us. So we'll continue to remind the community that they have that process as well. And then we sort of put all that together, and then the board will be aware of all of that feedback and keep working the process from there. So great feedback on the high school, the open enrollment, the area there, and continue to refine it. So
thanks, Doug. Before we move on to our last agenda item, any questions about the process moving forward? Okay. So our final item, everyone has in their packet a document that looks like this. And our hope here next is that we're going to give you as much time as you want. We're going to close out our meeting. We're going to give you as much time as you'd like. Seriously, you can be here as long as you want. And spend some time providing some feedback to the board about whatever it is that we haven't covered, or maybe we have covered, and it's important to you. These will go to the board members. So these will be read. It's important. Please spend some time And anything that you want to share with the board, whether it's been covered or not, please include them on these sheets, okay? And again, we're going to give you as much time as you want to be able to fill these out as much as you want. And I think with that, Kent, maybe we'll have you close out the meeting and people can take their time and fill out the sheets. For my part, I would just like to thank you again for being a part of this process, and I look forward to seeing you at the upcoming sessions. So with that, Kent?
Well, thank you for your hard work. I know that we maybe haven't agreed on everything, but we've kept the conversation more than civil. It has been a very eye-opening discussion for me, and as I've said many times over my years of involvement, I started out as an advocate for my oldest son in special ed, and then 2 boys that graduated from Roosevelt, and we've got great schools in our school district. And as long as we keep in mind through all of our conversations that what we're doing is for the kids. It is not about my family or your family. It's about what is in the best interest of every child in our school district. If that's the conversation that we have, we're going to have some disagreement. It's going to be emotional, but we'll come to a good conclusion. So thank you all, and start writing.
Everyone, I'll be at the back of the room, and so if you could hand me your documents when you're done, okay?
doing an afternoon class. You know what it's doing. I honestly different maps. Yeah. Yeah. Where do you have that? Do you have an auditorium? The auditorium?
Excuse me.
I know it's I can't bet it up. Good reading.